Hey everyone, and thanks for joining. We've got an interesting session for you today, exploring some recent industry data. But first, some intros. I'm Trent Lanning, Product Marketing Manager here at Comply, and I'm joined by Brittany Fitzkonig and Medrick Dano. Brittany and Med, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Brittany Fitzkonig. I'm a solutions consultant. Been with Comply for about 4 years now.
Hi, everyone. I'm Med Dano. I'm SVP of Regulatory Services at Comply, and I've worked with registered investment advisors with various business models over the last 20 plus years. It's been my privilege to do so. Great to be here today.
Awesome, thanks both. And some housekeeping for everyone in attendance. If you have any questions today, feel free to throw them in the chat. We're going to compile the questions after this session and send out a Q&A document in the coming days. First off, Brittany, would you like to give a quick overview on Comply?
I would. So if you're not familiar with Comply, we're built on three core pillars, and those are compliance technology, compliance consulting, and compliance education. And these pillars work really well together to create a strong foundation that allows our firms to achieve 360-degree compliance. Now, our clients include RIAs, broker-dealers, duly registered firms, private funds, retail, investment banks, insurance, wealth managers. So we do have experience across the industry. And by leveraging this integrated approach with our regulatory expertise and our innovative technology, we're able to streamline compliance operations, reduce regulatory risk, help to orchestrate a more efficient compliance program, and ultimately, protect your firm, protect our clients, protect the investors.
Thanks, Brittany. Now some background on today's session. So in July and August of this year, we conducted a survey of nearly 600 compliance professionals across the US and UK. More than 6 in 10 of those were CCOs. Today, we're going to be unpacking some of those insights. We begin with calendars and documentation, foundational components that really anchor a compliance program. What we found first is that many compliance leaders still use either general calendar tools like Outlook or spreadsheets. Only about 4 in 10 are using compliance-specific platforms. Brittany, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, so this is interesting because in my conversations with firms, I often, ask, how do you manage compliance? Are you using a calendar? Where does it live? And it's not uncommon for compliance officers to not have a compliance calendar. So when I see this, I'm agnostic. I love a good spreadsheet. So it's less about where it lives and more about the effectiveness and efficiency of that solution or that tool that you're leveraging. And I think, like the SEC says, back to the basics, do we have a calendar? Are we capturing the activities and the procedures and the operations that need to happen somewhere, or does it live in somebody's head? And what are the risks there? So,
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. And even though about 6 in 10 are using, what we might call, relatively basic tools for their calendars, what they would like in those calendars does tend to paint a little bit of a different story. Things like links to policies and procedures and integration with other tools. Brittany, what are your thoughts there?
yeah, I think, the idea of a calendar that captures these things is phenomenal. Again, ties into how effective and easy is it to use across the team to collaborate. It's one thing to do something, but you got to make sure you document it, turn in your homework. How easy is it to do that? Where does the documentation live? So I love that link to integration with testing and documentation tools, but also direct links to policies and procedures. It's not uncommon for policies and procedures to sort of drift apart, and maybe what you're doing is not exactly in line with your policy. And how can we keep them in line, up to date together? And I think automation is a good way to do that.
I'd like to just chime in a little bit on Brittany's observations and comments there. I absolutely agree that for some firms, it's perfectly appropriate to use simple tools such as Outlook and spreadsheets. If you're a very small firm, that's fine. I mean, you want to tailor your compliance controls to your size and complexity, but since those tools are not designed specifically with compliance in mind, the CCO would typically still need to piece together separate documentation showing that calendared tasks were completed and what the results were of testing or other reminders that would come up on that calendar. So that further complicates the CCO's daily tasks and daily role. So,
Well, I mean, speaking about those daily tasks, daily roles, we do see a similar story. For compliance documentation, it often lives in spreadsheets. Brittany, I think you were talking about this with me recently. You posed a question regarding documentation. Could you touch on that?
Absolutely. So when I think about compliance process and operations and where the calendar lives and how compliance is managed, I often think about how easy would it be to produce documentation in the case of an exam? Do you know where everything's located? Is it documented? Where does it live? If you have 10 days to turn around a document request list, could you do that? Or how painful would it be for your firm? And if it would be painful, is there a better way?
That makes sense. And moving on, just want to highlight another little interesting finding related to some of this. So nearly 6 in 10 CCOs bear the responsibility of reviewing compliance documentation for completeness and accuracy. If nothing else, I mean, I think that does point to the level that some of these CCOs are in the weeds. They're dealing with this stuff themselves, and it's a lot to bear, and it's a big responsibility for you folks. So we get it. Speaking of some of that pressure, we'll dive a little deeper into manual processes and automation. I think there are a number of other activities that remain manual for compliance leaders. Many of these, they're high volume tasks. Brittany, did you want to touch on a couple of those?
Yeah, and again, like Matt said earlier, it all depends on the firm, the firm size, complexity, all of that. But certainly all of these things can be automated. The idea of manually doing employee trade monitoring and running through everyone's transactions and you have 20, 30, 40 employees, right? There's a better way and there's tools to help with that. Certifications, all of those things that can be very mundane activities, there are tools and systems to help. And I think the goal, right, is to do what needs to be done, but do it in an efficient manner and save time. We know that compliance teams are often stretched thin. And so anything that helps to make the process more efficient is hugely valuable.
So we asked what the barriers to adoption were. For me, the ROI component really stood out here. I know quantifying ROI can be a bit of a challenge in compliance. Brittany, any thoughts there on how leaders can like sort of quantify and make the case for automation?
Yeah, so this is a challenging scenario. It's something that we help firms to justify constantly. And it often seems like there has to be some sort of catalyst to, ignite a desire for more automation or more resources. And unfortunately, sometimes that is often an examination or a key compliance resource leaving the team. And so I think through some of our conversations and educational resources, we're trying to really put it at the forefront that maybe we should get ahead of some of those pains happening, and be more proactive with investment in compliance, because oftentimes the cost of investing in compliance outweighs the risks of not doing so.
Yeah, and I was thinking oftentimes you're reporting to your leadership or your board, like they want to see metrics. They want to see like, are you getting that return? And we were just recently at Comply Connect a few weeks ago, and we were asking folks about how they make the case for new technology, new automation tools. Some of them were pointing to enforcement trends, say, hey, this is what has happened to other firms when they weren't compliant. And then the other opportunity, I would think, especially when we saw like the level of manual trade monitoring or certifications, would be, what if you just like take a little bit of time, connect with your team, and see how much time you're spending, whether that's hours per week on some of these tasks that could easily be automated. We're going to pivot to some insights into risk assessments and testing. Um, Look, regularly assessing risk goes hand in hand with building a proactive compliance program, and it's promising to see that many compliance leaders are conducting risk assessments frequently. Med, were you happy to see these metrics and how common it is for folks to be assessing risk like this?
I was. Yeah, I think this is very encouraging. Look, investment advisors are fiduciaries. The fiduciary duty includes two components: duty of loyalty, duty of care. And the duty of loyalty requires that advisors eliminate or at least expose conflicts of interest. that may incline an advisor to render advice that's not disinterested. So naturally, to eliminate or otherwise disclose or mitigate material conflicts of interest and other factors that create risk for your firm, you have to know they exist, right? So you have to undertake that exercise of identifying those risks. That's why this is such an important precursor for preparing adequate disclosure, for preparing and reviewing written policies and procedures and other controls. So risk assessments are foundational. They're a precursor to everything. They are the measuring stick for the compliance program. So these polled compliance professionals clearly recognize the importance of that fundamental tasks. I mean, you need your policies and procedures and your disclosures to be connected to and address the specific risks that are inherent in the firm. So and because changes will occur often throughout the year, it's encouraging, I think, that firms are looking at this, many of them, more often than annually. I think quarterly is probably about the right cadence there. So this was a very encouraging finding.
Cool. That's good to hear. So, we also asked more broadly about compliance testing and what sorts of things compliance leaders are keen to outsource. I think this gives visibility into the types of needs that aren't always easy for in-house teams to perform. Cybersecurity assessments top the list here. I would assume that's because these assessments require a particularly technical skill set. Would you guys be in agreement with that?
I think so. I mean, it makes with respect to cybersecurity, a lot of firms aren't necessarily going to have the level of expertise that they'd like in-house, so that makes perfect sense. With respect to e-communications reviews, that might be more not technical expertise, but more just sheer volume. Can be very, very time consuming to review email and other e-communications on an ongoing basis. Similarly, code of ethics testing can be time consuming, can require very in-depth scrutiny. So offloading these tasks would certainly free up significant resources that could be applied elsewhere throughout the firm.
Moving into exam pain points, some exam concerns. Med, I noticed some of these seem to align with areas of increased regulatory focus, like marketing oversight, off-channel comms. Could you give some insight into some of those areas?
Yeah, absolutely. Not at all surprising that marketing oversight would top the list of exam day concerns. The marketing rule has been included in SEC examination priorities each year since adoption of what we're still calling the new rule, although it's several years old at this point. That rule also is principles based rather than prescriptive, like the old advertising rule, which of course is liberating, and or firms can feel that it's liberating, but it's also very terrifying with standards such as quote unquote fair and balanced. It's natural, I think, that compliance professionals would wonder if they've gotten it right. And this is an area that marketing that continues to be flagged by the commission as a significant area for scrutiny and deficiencies. So certainly suggests heightened scrutiny, hence it rating very high on the list. Some of these others as well, the inconsistent supervision. I'm thinking back to a 2020 risk alert that highlighted the inconsistent application by firms of their policies and procedures, particularly in the context of branch offices and things like that. So maybe that's where that's coming from. Record keeping and documentation gaps. Our comply consultants will often hear from investment advisor clients that they have a fair amount of confidence that they're testing in the right areas, but have some concerns that the documentation evidencing that oversight may be lacking. So that again is not surprising. The off-channel communications, I will say, is a little surprising, just a little bit. And the reason for that is, yes, it was a huge issue under the Gensler Commission, resulted in significant fines against multiple firms. and had been a concern for a number of years as a result, and as it should be. Now, the current leadership at the SEC has shifted focus a bit, really focusing and drilling down on fundamentals. However, off-channel communications are likely to still show up in other ways, both through deficiencies in examinations, where controls are inadequate, but potentially may continue to show up in enforcement actions in other ways. I hearken back to this marketing rule scrutiny. And look, if you're communicating with more than one person about touting the firm's services, that's marketing. And if you don't have the required records around that marketing, what the content is, who it went out to, the substantiation of any claims in there, then that's potentially a problem. So it makes sense that this is sort of a continuing concern, I think, of compliance professionals come exam day.
That's very great insight, Med. Thank you. We're going to pivot now a little bit to AI. Obviously, firms looking to scale oversight. AI offers an appealing lever to do that, and lots of compliance leaders are using it in some capacity. Remember these numbers. 69% are using it right now. 27% are exploring adoption. Remember those for in a few minutes from now. First of all, among those 69% who are using AI today, common use cases: risk scoring, summarizing documents, assisting with marketing and communications reviews. Those are the biggest areas. Now, adoption notwithstanding, there are plenty of concerns around AI adoption. Compliance leaders recognize the challenges, but they're moving forward with adoption anyway. Med, particularly the regulatory expectations component, could you touch on that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Trent. So before I touch on the regulatory expectations, I do want to acknowledge that the risk that arises when an investment advisor rolls out or implements artificial intelligence into its operations is going to depend on how that AI is used. And that runs the gamut from fairly low to moderate risk on up to extremely high risk. And the SEC recognizes that fact, and has specifically called that out in the 2025 examination priorities, where they talked about the different ways that AI can be used. And they're going to be very, very interested in examining how firms are using AI and whether or not they've addressed that risk. For example, a lower risk use might be, if you're just simply using AI for internal meetings, note-taking in internal meetings. But if you're utilizing artificial intelligence to make investment decisions on behalf of clients, much higher risk, particularly if there's not human intervention there. With respect to regulatory expectations and disclosures, the SEC did create an AI task force just a couple months ago, August 2025. And the initial mandate, as I understand, is that the purpose of that task force is to promote innovation and efficiency within the commission itself. Not necessarily new rulemaking or guidance for the industry, though it could evolve into that. So in the interim, we're left with a little bit of a gap. There's not a specific rule there. We had a predictive analytics rule proposed, which really would have only covered some of the risks, not all of the risks of AI, but that was withdrawn, that was rolled back. So, but look, we are all still fiduciaries as investment advisors. We're required to ensure that our compliance programs address risk. AI certainly gives rise to quite a bit of risk. Some of them also are talked about here. One of the most commonly cited risks in AI implementation is data privacy and security. And you see that they're ranking really, really high among the poll as well. So that is not surprising. One other one I do want to call out before I turn it back over to you, Trent, is the model transparency and explainability. That's another one that firms have been concerned with because, again, as a fiduciary, an investment advisor has to provide advice that is tailored to the financial circumstances of their clients. And those advisors can be called upon to show the basis for the advice given and how it links back to those financial circumstances. sometimes that's hard to see if you've got that advice coming from an AI model. So interesting results here.
Yep. Thanks, Med. And I just want to call out one more time, like we saw that first slide on AI, like nearly 7 in 10 are using it in some capacity. So I think it's interesting to see that figure laid next to more than half are still noting risk in several key areas. So they're deciding to use it even though they acknowledge that there could be risk there. So again, I said at the beginning, remember that 69% of people who are using AI. Um, Only 49% are saying that they have a formal AI policy and governance structure. I thought that was a pretty interesting disparity. Med, thoughts?
Yeah, for me, probably one of the most eye-opening revelations of the survey. Uh, as I mentioned, investment advisors are required to assess risk inherent in their operations and adopt policies and procedures and other controls to address that risk. So this mismatch between the adoption of artificial intelligence within firm operations and all the risks that bring, many of which will be recognized by compliance professionals, and governance not keeping pace, I assume is not lost on the compliance professionals here that are responsible for the programs within that 51% of firms with no formal policy or government structure. So yeah, eye-opening result there, to be sure.
We're going to move on to compliance culture, kind of tying everything together. Thought this was pretty interesting. So overall, leaders generally consider their firms to have a strong compliance culture. There are, of course, some caveats. What stood out to me is that 41% who were saying like it's generally supportive but reactive. Um, in the compliance world, like we don't like to hear that phrase reactive. We'd much rather hear, proactive culture of compliance. Brittany, Med, could you weigh in on the importance, in your opinion, of a proactive culture of compliance?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I mean, culture of compliance is everything, right? It's that goes back to the whole, don't talk about it, be about it. Compliance is not just something that lives on a spreadsheet. It is, infiltrated into the firm. And I wonder if some of the responders were a little bit generous with these results because 51% saying they have a strong culture, 41% saying strong but reactive. Um, I think there are still a lot of firms out there that operate on the belief that, hey, we're not intentionally doing anything wrong. We're okay. We have a good culture, but it really does go much deeper than that.
Yeah, I think that while a chief compliance officer, for example, can administer a compliance program and is responsible for doing so, compliance culture starts from the top, and the tone that's set from firm leadership, both in words, deeds, by example. So how involved leadership is, lending support to compliance initiatives, allocating sufficient resources to a compliance program so that it can keep pace with emerging technologies such as AI or other, shifting risks or changes within the firm or regulatory requirements, all are considered paramount to the underpinning philosophy of the compliance program rule and really the Investment Advisors Act as a whole.
Yep. And then moving to like some other, challenge areas, particularly around, culture. Um, some top areas, cybersecurity and data handling. We also saw that with AI concerns. The second stat on this page is what really stood out to me, employee understanding of policies. Like that is really fundamental to compliance. Like Brittany, Med, you want to chime in there? Like that stood out to me.
Yeah, I would agree. That's concerning. We always talk about compliance training and education and how best to translate expectations to the team, and that is definitely a huge number. Uh, with again, having a compliance program, having policies, having expectations, you want the people at the firm to be able to carry those out and see those through. And if there's confusion, then that's going to lead to some further risks and gaps, and the compliance officer is going to have a lot more work on their hands.
Yeah, I think well said. The touchstones of an annual review, which is a requirement under the compliance program rule for advisors, is adequacy and effectiveness. Whether your policies are adequate links back to the risk assessment whether they're effective. Firms will test their policies over the course of the year. They'll kind of look back at patterns, and if they see that certain policies simply don't seem to be effective because they're just not followed, one of the things that we are always encouraging those advisors to do is to look at, is it actually the policy, or is it the employee's understanding of what those requirements and expectations of the firm are? And this seems to bear that out, that that's a concern of compliance professionals. So yeah, if employees don't understand what the expectation is, then the likelihood of them breaching policies is much, much higher, and that creates a lot of risk for the firm.
And of course, I mean, we have to have the discussion about resourcing. Do leaders feel that they have the sufficient resources to run their compliance programs? And I think it's pretty promising, at least on first glance, like 4 and 5 are saying like, yes, I have at least enough to handle it for now. There is a pretty notable minority, that 17% who just say no. You scale out 17% across many financial firms, like that is a bit of a concern. Matt, I know you had like a really interesting SEC example. Did you want to cover that?
Yeah, sure. I just want to say I agree that 81% is encouraging. The 17% is not insignificant. So the SEC has long associated the CCO's competence and how empowered they are in the firm, and those are also requirements that come from the compliance program rule, to whether the firm has allocated sufficient resources to the compliance program. And so I wanted to just read from an actual client deficiency letter, and this is going back several years. And I'm going to read this verbatim. To be effective, a compliance program must be administered by someone who can identify compliance risks present within the firm's operations. The ability to identify such risks is directly dependent upon a person's understanding of applicable regulations. As evidenced by the numerous issues cited throughout this report, however, it appears that registrant may not have allocated sufficient resources for the CCO, and registrant's compliance program may not be effective at detecting or preventing violations of securities laws. That firm was actually re-examined by the SEC less than 2 years later. Very, very interested on whether or not there was a change made to how they're allocating sufficient resources. So yeah, interesting. But again, 81%, that's encouraging. Just a cautionary note there for the 17%.
Straight from the SEC. Appreciate the insight, Matt, on that. All right, so we concluded the survey with an open-ended question. What professionals need to lead more strategically? And just reading through this, I think this rings true with a lot of what we hear from clients and firms, especially regarding the need for that executive support and investment. Brittany, did you want to touch on this?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So in my role, I often find myself collaborating with compliance teams to show the executive leaders why this is so important, why they need the tools and the resources, and they need to enhance their compliance program. And like Med just did here by reading from the deficiency letter, a lot of this comes down to education and real life scenarios, and ensuring that all the way up to the top, there's a clear understanding of the risks and the benefits and the rewards of investing in compliance, whether that is an additional person, whether that's additional tools, training, consulting resources. And there's resources available through things like what we're doing here with education and the numbers and evidencing that all go into putting together an ROI and helping to sell this to your internal leaders.
Agreed, Brittany. You cannot have an effective compliance program, or you cannot prevent violations if your compliance program is reactive. So yeah, that allocation of sufficient resources is paramount.
Right on. So, Med, Brittany, really appreciate you guys taking some time today to provide some insight into this data. I think one thing we're really interested in at Comply is delivering like fresh, original research, and this survey is one way that we're doing that. Closing thoughts, Med, Brittany?
I think that strategic and proactive risk management is key to adequate and effective compliance programs. Compliance professionals recognize that. And they also recognize where their compliance programs are falling short. And they're very, very keen on getting the resources that they need to make sure that their programs keep pace, and that they can adequately protect their firms.
Like we started, at the beginning, comply and our pillars and how our goal is to help our firms achieve compliance across the board. Within the business, we have regulatory services teams that provide registration services, new firm, compliance program design and tools to manage compliance from the ground up. We support firms that are established and need some help to restructure, reorganize, become more efficient and manage things a bit better. We have the consulting expertise to weigh in on your compliance program, help you to identify those gaps and strengthen your ongoing operations. So really end to end with our technology solutions, our technology tools, whether it is a holistic relationship, providing you with all of the things across our services and software solutions, or if it's project based, we want to be your partner. We want to be an instrumental resource and a proactive resource in helping you to strengthen your program and be the support you're looking for.
Thank you so much again, Med, Brittany. And thank you everyone for in attendance today. Again, if you have any questions, you can feel free to drop them in the chat now, or you can just send them directly to my email, tlanning@comply.com, and we will compile a Q&A document and disperse that in the coming days. Thank you, everyone.